Imagine being so terrified of human contact that you'd rather die alone than risk a single touch. Imagine being so consumed by paranoia that even in death, you'd forbid anyone from preparing your body for burial. This is the story of King Aldric, the Untouchable, a ruler whose fear of poison and betrayal became so extreme that it shaped not only his life, but his death. And what happened 3 centuries later, when archaeologists finally opened his sealed tomb. What they found inside wasn't just the remains of a paranoid king. It was evidence that maybe, just maybe, his fears weren't paranoia at all. Maybe someone really was trying to kill him. And maybe they succeeded in ways far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. In the year 1412, in the forgotten kingdom of Valdres, nestled between the mountains of what we now call Eastern Europe, there ruled a king whose name has been deliberately erased from most historical records. King Aldric III, known by his subjects as the Untouchable, was not born into paranoia. In fact, historical accounts suggest he was once a beloved prince, known for his warmth and his habit of walking freely among his people, shaking hands, embracing children, and sharing meals with commoners and nobles alike. But something changed him, something so profound and terrifying that it transformed a beloved ruler into a man who would spend the last 15 years of his life in complete isolation. Refusing all human contact, eating only food he prepared himself, and sleeping in a chamber that could only be accessed through a series of 7 locked doors, each key held by a different trusted guard, who was never allowed to speak to the others. The transformation began with the death of his younger brother, Prince Matthias, according to the court physician's records, which were discovered in the 1970s hidden behind a false wall in what remained of the royal castle. Prince Matthias died of what appeared to be a sudden illness. He had been perfectly healthy that morning, laughing and joking with his brother during their daily sword practice, but by evening, he was dead. His body covered in strange black marks that seemed to spread like ink beneath his skin. The physician's notes describe something that sounds almost impossible. The prince's flesh turned black from within, as if painted by the devil's own brush. His eyes became pools of darkness, and his breath carried the scent of decay while he yet lived. Most disturbing of all, the blackness seemed to move beneath his skin, writhing like serpents in a bag. King Aldric was devastated by his brother's death, but what truly broke him was what happened during the funeral. As was tradition, the king was expected to kiss his brother's forehead as a final farewell. The moment Aldric's lips touched his brother's cold skin, witnesses reported that the black marks on the corpse began to spread, reaching toward the king's face like hungry fingers. Aldric pulled away in horror, and within minutes, the black marks had consumed the entire body, leaving behind what observers described as a thing that no longer resembled a man, but rather a shadow given form. From that day forward, King Aldric refused all physical contact. He dismissed his food tasters, claiming they might be compromised. He stopped shaking hands with visiting dignitaries. He even refused to touch his own crown, instead having it suspended above his head by a series of chains during court proceedings. His subjects thought he had gone mad with grief, but Aldric knew something they didn't. He had felt something when he kissed his brother's corpse. Something had tried to enter him through that contact. Something cold and hungry and very much alive. The king's paranoia deepened when his trusted advisor, Lord Garrett, began showing signs of the same mysterious illness that had killed Prince Matthias. But this time, Aldric was watching. He noticed that the black marks appeared first on Garrett's hands, specifically on his fingers, as if something was entering through his skin. More disturbing still, the marks seemed to appear in the exact spots where Garrett had touched other people throughout the day. Aldric began conducting his own investigation, spending hours in the castle's ancient library, searching through texts on poison, disease, and darker subjects. What he found in a book written by a monk 3 centuries earlier chilled him to the bone. The book spoke of a plague that was not a plague, a disease that was not a disease, but rather a curse passed through touch, created by those who had died with such hatred in their hearts that death itself could not contain their malice. According to the text, Those infected would spread the curse to others through any physical contact, and the curse would lie dormant until the moment of death, when it would consume the body entirely, leaving behind only a vessel for the hatred that had created it. The monk's book claimed that the only way to stop the curse was to avoid all human contact and, upon death, to be sealed away without any preparation of the body, allowing the curse to die with its host. Aldrich's fears were confirmed when Lord Garrett died in the same horrifying manner as Prince Matthias. But this time, the king was prepared. He had Garrett's body immediately sealed in a lead coffin and buried in unconsecrated ground, with strict orders that no one should ever disturb the grave. The spread of the mysterious illness stopped, but the damage to Aldrich's psyche was complete. The king retreated into his castle and began implementing increasingly extreme measures to protect himself from contamination. He had his food prepared by servants who were required to wear leather gloves at all times and who were forbidden from touching anything that might come into contact with the king's meals. His clothes were washed with water that had been blessed by 7 different priests, and then boiled for hours. His chamber was cleaned daily with a mixture of salt, holy water, and herbs that were said to ward off evil spirits. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the king's treatment of his own family. When his wife, Queen Isabella, pleaded with him to end his isolation, he had her confined to a tower on the opposite side of the castle, claiming that even she might be a carrier of the curse. When his young son, Prince Eric, tried to approach his father, the king screamed at him to stay away, warning that the curse was drawn to royal blood and that contact with him would mean certain death for the child. The kingdom began to fall apart. Without their king's presence, the nobles grew restless and began plotting against each other. Trade agreements fell through because visiting merchants and diplomats were refused audiences with the king. The people began to whisper that their ruler had been possessed by demons or driven mad by grief. Some even suggested that the king himself was the source of the curse that he had somehow brought this evil upon the kingdom. As the years passed, Aldrich's isolation became more complete. He stopped holding court entirely, communicating only through written messages passed through a series of servants, who were required to handle his correspondence with long metal tongs. He began sleeping in a bed that was surrounded by a moat of salt water, believing that the curse could not cross running water mixed with blessed salt. His meals were delivered through a complex system of pulleys and ropes, ensuring that no human hand could touch his food after it was prepared. But even these precautions were not enough to ease the king's fears. He became convinced that the curse was evolving, finding new ways to reach him. He claimed that he could feel it pressing against the walls of his chamber at night, searching for any crack or opening through which it might enter. He reported seeing black shadows moving beneath his door and hearing whispers in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. The king's final years were spent in a state of constant terror. He stopped sleeping, afraid that unconsciousness would make him vulnerable to the curse. He began to lose weight rapidly, refusing more and more foods as he became convinced that the curse had found ways to contaminate them. His hair turned white, then began falling out in clumps. His skin became pale and translucent, and his eyes developed a strange, luminous quality that servants described as unholy. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the king began to change physically in ways that suggested his fears might not have been entirely unfounded. Servants reported that his shadow seemed to move independently of his body, sometimes appearing to reach toward them when the king himself was standing perfectly still. His reflection in mirrors began to show black marks similar to those that had killed his brother and Lord Garrett, though no such marks were visible on his actual skin. When King Aldrich finally died in the year 1420, at the age of 43, he was found in his chamber, seated on his throne, with a look of absolute terror frozen on his face. His body showed no signs of the black marks that had killed others, but there was something else that deeply disturbed those who discovered him. The room was ice cold. Despite the roaring fire in the fireplace, and every mirror in the chamber had cracked, as if something had struck them from the inside. True to his wishes, the king's body was not embalmed or prepared for burial in any traditional sense. Instead, following detailed instructions he had left behind, his corpse was wrapped in sheets that had been soaked in holy water and salt, then placed in a coffin made of lead and lined with silver. The coffin was sealed with wax that had been blessed by 12 different priests, and the entire container was placed inside a stone sarcophagus that was then sealed with mortar mixed with ground bones from saints. The king's tomb was built in the deepest part of the castle's foundations, in a chamber that was walled off completely after the burial. No doors were left, no windows, no access of any kind. The location was deliberately forgotten, and within a generation, no one remained who knew exactly where the king had been laid to rest. For 3 centuries, the tomb remained undisturbed. The castle above crumbled and fell into ruin, eventually becoming nothing more than a pile of stones covered by forest growth. The kingdom of Valdres was absorbed by neighboring lands, and the very name of King Aldric, the Untouchable, faded into obscurity. Local legends spoke of a cursed king who had been driven mad by demons, but most dismissed these as folk tales meant to frighten children. But in 1972, everything changed. A team of archaeologists, led by Dr. Helena Vasquez, was conducting excavations in the area, searching for evidence of medieval settlements. Using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered what appeared to be a large underground chamber beneath the ruins of what had once been a castle. The chamber was completely sealed, with no apparent entrance, which made it an irresistible target for investigation. It took 3 weeks of careful excavation to break through the stone and mortar that sealed the chamber. When they finally opened it, the archaeologists found themselves in a room that had been perfectly preserved for over 3 centuries. The air inside was dry and cold, with a strange, sweet smell that none of them could identify. At the center of the chamber stood a stone sarcophagus, its surface covered in symbols that appeared to be a mixture of Christian iconography and much older pagan markings. Dr. Vasquez later described the moment they opened the sarcophagus as the most disturbing experience of my career. Inside, they found the lead coffin, still sealed with wax, that had somehow remained intact after all these centuries. But there was something else in the sarcophagus that shouldn't have been there. A thick, black substance that seemed to move and shift in the light from there. Flashlights. The team documented everything carefully before attempting to open the lead coffin. When they finally broke the seal, they were hit by a wave of cold air that seemed to come from the coffin itself. Despite the fact that the chamber had been sealed for centuries, inside the coffin, wrapped in sheets that had somehow remained perfectly white, they found the body of King Aldric. But this was where the story took a turn that none of them had expected. The king's body was perfectly preserved, showing no signs of decomposition, despite being 3 centuries old. His skin was pale but supple, his hair still full and dark, his eyes closed as if he were merely sleeping. But there was something wrong with the preservation, something that didn't match any known natural or artificial mummification process. Dr. Vasquez ordered X-rays of the body, and what they revealed was impossible to explain. The king's bones were black, completely black, as if they had been stained with ink from the inside. His organs, which should have either decomposed or been removed during preservation, were still present, but had been replaced by a substance that looked like crystallized shadows. Most disturbing of all, the X-rays showed movement inside the body, as if something was shifting and flowing through the king's preserved form. When the team attempted to take samples for analysis, they discovered that the king's skin would not cut. Scalpels, needles, even diamond-tipped tools simply would not penetrate his flesh. It was as if his body had become something other than human tissue, something that existed in a state between life and death. But the truly horrifying discovery came when Dr. Vasquez accidentally brushed against the king's hand while positioning him for photography. The moment her skin made contact with his, she felt a sensation she later described as ice-cold electricity running up her arm. Within hours, she began developing black marks on her fingers, marks that looked exactly like those described in the ancient physician's notes they had found in the castle ruins. The team immediately sealed the coffin and evacuated the chamber, but it was too late. Over the following weeks, every member of the archaeological team began showing signs of the same mysterious condition. The black marks spread slowly, appearing first on their hands, and then moving up their arms like living tattoos. They experienced a constant sensation of cold, as if their blood had been replaced with ice water. Most disturbing of all, they began to crave darkness. Finding sunlight painful and seeking out the deepest, darkest places they could find, Dr. Vasquez spent her final weeks researching the condition, trying to understand what had happened to them. She discovered that the black substance they had found in the sarcophagus was not decay or mold, but something far more sinister. Chemical analysis revealed that it was organic in nature, but unlike anything in known biology. It seemed to be a form of life that existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for contact with living tissue to activate. In her final report, written just days before her death, Dr. Vasquez theorized that King Aldrich had somehow been infected with a form of parasitic entity that fed on life force through physical contact. The entity had remained dormant in his body for centuries, waiting for someone to break the seal and make contact with its host. The king's paranoia hadn't been madness at all, it had been a desperate attempt to contain something that was far worse than any earthly disease. The chamber was sealed again, this time with concrete and steel, and the site was declared off-limits indefinitely. But the damage was done. The archaeological team had all died within 3 months of opening the tomb, each of them succumbing to the same horrifying transformation that had claimed Prince Matthias and Lord Garrett centuries earlier. Their bodies were cremated and their ashes scattered, but some say that wasn't enough to stop the spread of whatever had been sleeping in that tomb. Local residents reported strange occurrences in the months following the excavation. People began avoiding the area around the sealed chamber, claiming that the ground itself felt cold and that shadows moved in unnatural ways. Some reported seeing figures in the forest at night, figures that looked like the dead archaeologists, but moved with a strange, jerky gait, as if they were puppets being controlled by invisible strings. The most disturbing reports came from the local hospital, where several patients were admitted with symptoms that matched those described in the medieval texts. These patients had never been near the excavation site, never had contact with the archaeological team, but they showed the same black marks, the same crystalline transformation of their internal organs, the same craving for darkness that had characterized the ancient curse. Dr. Maria Santos, the physician who treated these patients, documented their condition extensively before she too began showing signs of infection. Her notes reveal that the curse, or whatever it was, had evolved over the centuries. It no longer required direct contact to spread, could be transmitted through proximity, through breathing the same air, through simply being in the presence of someone who carried it. The last entry in Dr. Santos's medical journal, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic as the infection progressed, reads, "It's not a disease. It's not a curse. It's something that was never meant to exist in our world. Something that slipped through the cracks between life and death." King Aldrich wasn't trying to protect himself from poison or assassination. He was trying to protect the world from something that had chosen him as its host. We should have left him alone. We should have let him rest. Now it's loose again, and I don't think we can stop it this time. The area around the former Kingdom of Valdris was quietly evacuated by government authorities, and the entire region was declared a quarantine zone. Official reports claimed that the evacuation was due to chemical contamination from an old mining operation, but those who knew the truth understood that something far more sinister was at work. Today, the site remains sealed and abandoned. Satellite imagery shows that the forest around the king's tomb has died, leaving behind a perfect circle of dead trees that seems to grow larger each year. The few researchers who have been allowed to study the site from a distance report that the air above the area is always cold, regardless of the season, and that electronic equipment fails to function properly within a mile of the tomb. But perhaps, most disturbing of all, are the reports from the nearest town, located nearly 50 miles from the quarantine zone. residents have begun reporting sightings of a man in medieval clothing wandering the streets at night. He appears to be searching for something or someone, and those who have seen him describe his eyes as holes in the world, filled with a darkness that seems to pull at your soul. The figure matches historical descriptions of King Aldric the Untouchable, but that's impossible. The king's body remains sealed in its tomb, monitored by remote sensors that confirm the chamber has never been breached, yet the sightings continue, and each one is accompanied by reports of people in the area developing the same mysterious symptoms that killed the archaeological team. Some researchers theorize that the entity that infected King Aldric was never contained, that it simply learned to project itself beyond the physical confines of its host. Others believe that the king's preserved body is somehow still alive, still conscious, still struggling to contain the horror that has been eating away at him for over 6 centuries. But the truth may be even more terrifying. According to the few remaining documents from the original Kingdom of Valdris, King Aldric was not the first ruler to suffer from this condition. References to similar cases stretch back over 1,000 years, always involving royalty, always involving the same symptoms, always ending with the same desperate attempts at isolation and containment. The documents suggest that the entity is not random in its choice of hosts. It specifically targets those in positions of power, those who have contact with many people, those who can spread its influence widely before anyone realizes what's happening. King Aldric's paranoia may have prevented a medieval pandemic, but his sacrifice was only temporary. The entity waited, patient and eternal, for its next opportunity, and now it has one. The archaeological team that opened the tomb has carried the infection to universities, to museums, to government agencies. Unlike the medieval world, our modern society is interconnected in ways that make containment nearly impossible. Every handshake, every casual touch, every moment of human contact could be spreading something that was never meant to exist in our world. The story of King Aldric, the Untouchable, serves as a warning about the dangers of disturbing things that were deliberately hidden away. Some secrets are kept not to protect the truth from the world, but to protect the world from the truth. Some tombs are sealed not to honor the dead, but to prevent the dead from returning. And some forms of isolation are not symptoms of madness, but acts of incredible courage by those who choose to sacrifice everything to protect everyone else. The next time you shake hands with a stranger, the next time you embrace a friend, the next time you make any form of physical contact with another human being, remember the story of the king who refused to be touched. Remember that sometimes the greatest acts of love are acts of complete separation. And remember that in the deepest parts of the world, in the darkest corners of history, there are things waiting that should never be awakened, because King Aldric the Untouchable may have been the first to understand the true horror of human contact. But according to the reports still coming in from that quarantine zone, he certainly wasn't the last. The entity that chose him as its host is still out there, still spreading, still searching for its next royal victim. And in our interconnected world, where everyone can potentially reach everyone else, we might all be royalty in its eyes. The tomb remains sealed, the body remains preserved, and the mystery remains unsolved. But one thing is certain, King Aldric's greatest fear wasn't death. It was what would happen if he allowed himself to be touched. And now, 3 centuries later, we're beginning to understand that his fear may have been the only thing standing between humanity and something far worse than death. The question now is whether we'll be wise enough to learn from his example, or whether we'll repeat the mistakes of those archaeologists who thought they knew better than a king who had spent 15 years learning to fear the touch of another human being. Because if the reports from the quarantine zone are accurate, we may not get a second chance to make the right choice.